Fashion then and now. I decided on this topic because fashion and fashion culture really interest me. I wanted to know more about how fashion today has been affected and is similar to fashion in the 13th or 18th century. I've taken quotes from my research and will elaborate and expound upon them. I have them here all over my poster. I will start with fashion culture and talk about what was primarily worn in the 16th century. And then I will move to Renaissance ideals of fashion. Following that, I will discuss how Renaissance fashion affects us today. And then finally, I will conclude with how classism applies to fashion then and now. So to start, fashion culture. What is fashion culture? In an article called Fashion, Gender, Culture, and Cultural Anxiety in Italian Baroque Literature by Eugene Policelli, I found a part that says, quote, "Clothes are part of fashion, and as such are akin to manners, gestures, lifestyles, choices, and ways of behaving," end quote. So basically, fashion isn't just clothes that you wear, it's attitude. It's how you present yourself. It's how you act. Fashion is a word that encompasses the whole presentation of self. Next, I'm going to give a brief overview about what they wore. So, for men's clothing, I have a small image here, which you can't really tell. It's really blurry. But the quote that I have underneath it is from an article called Beauty Adorns Virtue, Italian Renaissance Fashion by Lane Eagles. And the quote says, 16th century men dressed down to display seriousness and sobriety. Men's tuxes, jackets, and stockings were generally tailored from black or dark brown luxury fabrics like velvet or silk. So basically what that means is men's clothing was fairly simple and they had a point. Next, from the same article, I'll talk about women's clothing. Women's clothing in the 16th century remained similarly structured, with several layers beneath a principal gown. However, a wider range of textures and additional details became fashionable. So where the men's clothing was much more simple, women's clothing was more detailed and more elaborate, with layers and texturing and all of these different beadings and details. So, roughly understand that. Next, I'm going to move to Renaissance values and as they apply to beauty. So, during my research, I found a great article that discusses Renaissance ideals of virtue and the idea of fashion culture. So, the article that I've already mentioned, Beauty Adorns Virtue, Italian Renaissance Fashion by Lane Eagles, I found a really great section, and it says, I have the quote right here, and it says, "Renaissance beauty was not skin deep. In order to be considered beautiful and fashionable, an early modern woman must also be virtuous." So what this basically means is the article depicts the idea that women couldn't just be pretty and wear nice clothes, but they were expected to remain pure and chaste to be considered beautiful. This idea of purity and chastity stems from many of the beliefs of the Catholic Church that were being emphasized at the time. And once again, we see the idea that fashion is more than just what you're wearing. It's how you act. Moving to the modern era and how we're being affected now, I found all of the quotes that I will use for this section from an article written last year about London Fashion Week. And it's called "A Renaissance Trend Takes Over London Fashion Week. Yes, you can expect neck ruffs and Juliet sleeves," written by Dina Silvers. So my first quote, which I have here, says, "Designers borrow from the era of cultural and artistic rebirth that followed the Middle Ages, taking the most noble styles of that period and overhauling them for a modern 21st century." So they're just taking what there was and they're bringing it to us to these days. So down here I have the quote, and it talks about the neck ruffles, and that were largely used in the fashion show. So it says ruffles were used originally intended to be simple collars, but eventually morphed into a much more involved accessory that was heavily starched and often served as a status symbol. Especially as the size of the neck adornment increased, the women needed to use wire frames to hold them up. So yes, all of these styles and these trends and these fashions from then were used in this fashion show, but those having the clothing styles used in the modern fashion show. But does that really mean that today we are influenced by the Renaissance era, and that how we dress and the clothing today is really influenced by that? That finally brings me to my last topic, which is classism. And you may be wondering where I'm going with this specific topic, and I myself wasn't sure which angle of the subject I was going to touch upon, but as I did more research, it became clear how I was going to present this. So, to start off, I have a quote from the article that I was just talking about, Renaissance Trends Take Over, by Dina Silvers, and it is up here with this image that I have, and I know you can't see the image, but the image is of a woman in a very beautiful gown. She has very nice big puff sleeves, lots of fabric, lots of beading. It's very, very elegant, very, very pretty. So the quote says, "Women who wore these types of sleeves were unable to perform manual labor due to the excessive fabric, and thus this style became a sign of wealth and high status." So basically, items of clothing used by the upper class were not always practical. They were just pretty. Next, I'm going to be talking about this image right here, which I also know you cannot see, but it's okay. It is an image of a woman, very decked out, lots of beading, very tight corseted, puffy sleeves, high collar. The quote that I found for this one is from The Beauty Adorns Virtue by Lane Eagles, and it says, "Upper class women often kept little dogs," which is in the image right there, "as luxury pets, as they were too small for hunting and thus only useful as companions and living accessories. The dog itself wears a gemstone collar." So they have the little puppy in there, and I think these two go really well hand in hand together, because it talks about how many of the wealthy had pointless accessories and were simply trying to show power. You would know that they had power because what they had wasn't practical and it wasn't useful, whereas many of the working class had to dress a certain way so that way they could get their jobs done. So I'm going to move to this quote, which is from Lane Eagles' article, and it talks about another identifying factor of the wealthy at the time. So it says, "Red dyed fabrics have a historical pedigree of association with wealth. A hue of such high stature required the slaying of innumerable New World insects. Those bodies were crushed for textile dyes." So it's yet another show of that power. It wasn't an easy color to come by, and so when you had money and you could pay for it, that's what you would do. Many of the images I actually have up here have them wearing this color, this red, as that show. So there was a very defining feature between classes. There was those who could afford to have pointless outfits and living accessories and these colors, and then there was the working class. So my final quote that I have about classism will really tie it into my conclusion at the end. And so it is from Lane Eagles, article, and it says fashion trends in this period were generally set by the aristocracy and upper class. A patron's closet relied on a vast network of tailors, dressmakers, pursemakers, metalsmiths, furriers, embroiderers, lace makers, and leather workers to stay abreast of the latest trends. So I really like that first line that says fashion trends in this period were generally set by the aristocracy and upper class. So my conclusion to this was those who had power, money, and influence were the ones setting the trends, the ones making the choices of what looks good and what didn't. Going back to my original topic, how does this affect us? Where do we still see this in the world today? And who are the people setting many of our trends in modern society? Today we have celebrities, models, and internet influencers that make many of the trends that we see in our day-to-day lives. They do things and they wear things and we follow their lead. The people with status get to make the trends, then and now. They dictate what name brands you should wear, whether you should wear Nikes or Adidas shoes, your Champion or your Supreme hoodie, and heaven forbid that you cross-brand. I mean, they're the ones that get to pick what brands are popular and which ones aren't. So, in conclusion to my presentation and of my research, we are not directly affected by the clothes of the 18th and through 13th century, but we are still majorly affected by the ideas that those who have power, money, and fame get to set the trends that we wear and do today. So our fashion is affected, like I said, because fashion isn't just the clothes. So even though we might not be wearing neck ruffs anymore, we're still falling back to the ideas of what fashion was being set by people of power, by people of status. So I'd like to close, and thank you.